So to continue with our discussion of Rambler number 4, where Johnson is talking about the problem with fiction, and he says that back in the day, reader or authors didn't have this problem because um, romances weren't realistic, right? So they could not be imitated. So in in a sense, for Johnson, reading, right, for those of us with small, inexperienced minds like women, right, reading becomes this dangerous activity, right? And he says that indecent ideas that are presented in novels, like if you look at something like uh, the novel A Sentimental Journey, right? And I'm sure you guys have never heard of it, but the idea of that novel, it follows this young man around as he kind of woos and regales all of the ladies, and he's pretty indiscriminate about that. But men get the idea that because they like the character, that's behavior that they can kind of emulate, or women because they are kind of admire this young guy, they'll be attached or attracted to a guy who is offering these kind of indecent ideas that will ultimately corrupt them, right? So it blurs the boundary between kind of good and bad, and that's what he says is dangerous. So he's saying that instead of using these characters as people of things of what not to do. They kind of because they're so inexperienced, they go and emulate this behavior when they shouldn't. Another example that I can readily think of off the top of my head is that there was this German novel, The Sorrows of Young Werther, and it is about this guy who is completely and utterly lovesick for this girl named Lotta, and Lotta ends up marrying another man, and he's heartbroken and forlorn, and at the end of the novel, Werther kills himself, and this prompts this. They called it the cult of Werther, where these readers fell in love with the protagonist. They even wore yellow pants that and blue coats that looked like him, and some even went so far as to commit suicide themselves. So it's this kind of idea of putting too much faith into what you read, and that for Samuel Johnson is dangerous. But in a lot of ways, though, I think that he is targeting female readers, and he has this kind of misogynistic idea that women, because their minds are smaller, can't distinguish between fact and fiction. And that's a concept that we'll see again when we read Northanger Abbey. So instead, he thinks that fiction should be used as kind of this utility, as this kind of tool. And I do want to note this emphasis on this idea of utility because they are more effective as teachers, right? And I think that goes back to the kind of Enlightenment era too, where things only have value if they are useful. They are more useful as tools than other types of works, because they mix delight with this kind of didactic goal in mind. So novels, in other words, are useful because they are teachers of morals, or they should be teachers of morals. They are a way of learning from observation from a safe distance. In that way, they are relatable. They offer readers a way of experiencing life safely from the sidelines, and they are beneficial for girls for teaching conduct, and those are kind of goes back to that idea of conduct manuals. But um, the purpose of these writings is surely not only to show mankind, right? but to, as he says, but to provide that they may be seen hereafter with less hazard, to teach the means of avoiding the snares which are laid by treachery for innocence, without infusing any wish for that superiority with which the betrayer flatters his vanity, to give the power of counteracting fraud without the temptation to practice it, to initiate youth by mock encounters in the art of necessary defense, and to increase prudence without impairing virtue. So, in other words, Johnson says that in order for fiction to be good, and why they need to be this way is because the goal of art is to make people better. Right. That is, and it goes back to this thing that we've seen time and time again, right? That the goal of literature is to make people better. Um, the goal of knowledge is to make people better. It's that concept that we've seen, to learn something through your reading. So he further goes on to say that verisimilitude is a wonderful thing. That is the goal of fiction. However, the problem comes is with the problem with verisimilitude is that many writers, for the sake of following nature, for the sake of showing how true, it becomes too real, it becomes too true. So many writers, for the sake of following nature, so mingle good and bad qualities in their principal personages that they are both equally conspicuous, and as we accompany them through their adventures with delight, are led by degrees to interest ourselves in their favor. We lose abhorrence of their faults because they do not hinder our pleasure, or perhaps regard them with some kindness for being united with so much merit. So, in other words, the problem happens is when writers blur the lines between the good and the bad. So if we look at kind of these, if you look at someone like Robin Hood, right? He's a bad guy. He steals, but he does it so for good reasons. So therefore, we kind of overlook the bad because we like them. Right? We've become connected to them. We've become attached to them, right? So when that happens, we overlook their faults, right? And when we overlook their faults, that opens us up to not recognizing vice when we should. He says that it is the utmost importance to mankind that positions of this tendency should be laid open and confuted. For while men consider good and evil as springing from the same root, they will spare the one for the sake of the other, and in judging, if not of others, at least of themselves, will be apt to estimate their virtues by their vices. In other words, it's important for authors, it's important for readers to make these clear distinctions between vice and virtue. Don't blur the good with the bad, so we'll have a clearer basis of which to make kind of these distinctions from. However, I don't know as if making these clear distinctions between good and bad is necessarily true to life, right? And I think that that's worth noting. So in some ways, he's saying, fiction should be true to life, but he's saying not too true to life because then it gives us these wrong impressions. So I have some real issues with what Johnson is saying in Rambler number 4. But he also says that novels are teaching young readers, and it's the writer's job to teach them the right thing. And that's basically where he's going with this entire essay, right? He's saying, if I have to like fiction, I want to like fiction that teaches um, young readers the right thing, the difference between right and wrong. I'm not going to advocate for fiction or literature that is dangerous or teaches or blurs the boundaries between good and bad. So, let me know what you guys think. I'm going to stop here and I'm going to pick up with the last of our readings for the week with The Spectator number 62.